Hello and welcome to this set of lecture videos. In this set of videos, we're going to be talking about acid-base balance, starting with some general concepts around achieving acid-base balance. Okay, so just a few things that I want to start off with. First of all, the normal pH range in the body is around 7.4. Okay, so 7.38 to 7.42 is considered normal pH. It's very important to maintain acid-base balance in our bodies because if our body fluids are at the wrong pH, that can denature our proteins, and our proteins are, like play a huge role in a lot of the functions in our bodies. So we don't want to do that. There are also other effects, like it can affect your nervous system and things like that. Okay. In order to maintain your pH at the normal range, what you need to do basically is make sure that your acid and base input, shown in this diagram here, matches your acid and base output. Okay, that way you won't throw off your acid-base balance. I want to introduce these terms here. Alkalosis is a term that we use to describe a condition where our pH goes above 7.42. Acidosis is our condition that we experience when our pH goes below 7.38. All right, so let's start by looking at sources of acids in the body, right? So again, remember, we want to match our input to our input of acids and bases to our output of acids and bases. So um, here we go. So sources of acids in the body, we have two main sources of acids in the body. First is our diet. Okay, so a lot of what we eat has acids in it. Proteins are made of amino acids. Fats are made of fatty acids. And so when we eat, we do naturally kind of acidify. Okay, there isn't much that we eat that is basic. The other main source of acids in our body is metabolism. So we have these acid intermediates. Well, lactic acid is not really an intermediate. It's like the final product of anaerobic glycolysis. And then we have a bunch of acids that we make during the citric acid cycle. Okay. Um, in terms of base input to our body, like I've already kind of mentioned, we don't really have much much in the way of bases entering our bodies. So really, our bodies are going to naturally over time tend to acidify, and this is what we want to work on counteracting in order to maintain our pH balance. Okay. All right, so what can we do in response to disturbances to our acid-base balance, right? So we can, usually it's going to be acidification coming from these sources. What can we do to protect against our plasma and our other body fluids becoming too acidic? We have three main lines of defense, basically, against acid-base disturbances. They are buffers, the respiratory system, and the kidneys. Okay, so let's go over these one by one, starting with buffers. All right, so buffers are shown right here in this box. Okay, so we have a series of buffers in our plasma and in our extracellular fluid that buffer changes in pH. Okay, the main one is going to be bicarbonate, but we also have others: phosphates, protein, hemoglobin, etc. Okay, but let's focus on bicarbonate. First of all, just to remind you, a buffer, hopefully you remember your basic chemistry, but a buffer basically is going to be a solution that's going to resist pH changes. So like when you add something acidic or basic to it, it's going to neutralize those small amounts of acid and base so that you can maintain pH. Okay, so that's what our buffers in our bodies are going to be doing. Okay. Okay, so here is an example of our buffer, bicarbonate. I want to remind you that we generate bicarbonate in our red blood cells, and then it gets pumped out into the plasma, okay? There, when it's in the plasma, it acts as a buffer for pH changes. So let's take a look at this example here. Right, so looking again at our carbonic acid reaction, well, actually here, we're just gonna look at this part right here, right? So we have bicarbonate here. If we have an increase in hydrogen ion in our plasma, what is going to happen? So just take a moment to think about that. What's that gonna do to this chemical equation? Okay, so hopefully you figured out we have an increase in hydrogen ion that's going to drive the leftward reaction, and it's going to favor the formation of more CO2. But the main point here is that H plus that we have interacts with bicarbonate and becomes something else so that the pH of the plasma stays relatively the same, okay? Okay, second mediator of acid-base balance, or our second line of defense against acid-base disturbances, is going to be the respiratory system, okay? So I think a lot of you have been waiting for this because, you know, we've made mention of it several times. But going back to the example that we just looked at, remember that when we had an increase in H plus, that was going to react with bicarbonate ion that's acting as a buffer in our plasma. I now want to ask you this question. So when we have that happen, what's going to happen to PCO2 and how is the respiratory system going to respond? So please take a moment, pause, think about that. Okay, so hopefully you figured out, well, we actually mentioned it in the last portion, if we have an increase in H plus, we're going to get an increase in CO2. And then what's going to happen is the respiratory system is going to respond by increasing ventilation to get rid of that CO2. So in that way, we are able to maintain acid-base balance. I do want to, oops, okay. Okay, so I do want to mention, since respiratory compensation is really quick, so respiratory compensation for acid-base disturbances, it actually accounts for about 75% of the pH regulation in the body, okay? Okay, so I do want to mention also, we have seen this in previous lectures, that the respiratory system, in addition to responding to pH disturbances, can also create pH disturbances, right? So this is a concept that, again, we've already sort of covered, but we're going to cover it more formally here. So let's take a look at these situations, right? So how does each of these situations affect pH? How does increased ventilation affect pH? How does decreased ventilation affect pH? So go ahead, hit pause, think about that, and come back when you're ready. Okay, so our response to increased ventilation, so if we are increasing ventilation, we're offloading a bunch of CO2, that's going to pull this equilibrium reaction in the leftward direction. That is going to decrease our concentration of hydrogen ions, and it is going to increase our pH. Looking at the response to decreased ventilation, it's going to be the opposite, right? So if we are not breathing enough, we are going to have our CO2 build up. That is going to drive this equilibrium reaction in the rightward direction. That is going to drive up our hydrogen ion concentration, which drives down our pH.